Did your family walk on eggshells or explode without warning?
The clinking of glasses and the low hum of voices filled the banquet hall, that polished suburban rental space my mother insisted was the only respectable venue for her birthday, because nothing in her life could ever be small or quiet. Relatives gathered in their carefully pressed outfits, neighbors who had no business being there crowded the tables, and I sat at the far end with a wine glass balanced in my hand, already rehearsing the ways I would politely excuse myself before the inevitable parade of forced compliments toward my brother began. My mother lived for these nights, where she could command attention like a director on stage, waiting for her cue. She got it right after dessert was cleared. She raised her glass, her diamond ring catching the lights, and with that smile she always wore when she was about to twist the knife, she said loudly enough for every head to turn, "Of course, my dear Emily won't have to worry about inheritance when I'm gone. Because she'll never inherit a thing. She's always been a disappointment." Laughter broke out, sharp, awkward, uncomfortable, the kind of laughter people use when they know they're complicit in cruelty, but don't dare interrupt it. My aunt's shrill giggle, my cousin's nervous chuckle, even a neighbor's muffled snort carried across the room like tiny bullets. I felt the burn of every glance, like heat pressing against my skin. I didn't flinch. I didn't give her the pleasure of seeing me crumble. Instead, I raised my glass slowly, letting the rim touch my lips just as I looked her dead in the eye and replied, calm as the wine I was sipping, "That's okay. I'm leaving the country forever." The laughter stopped like a faucet cut off midstream. Even the background chatter died. My mother's face froze in place, the smug curve of her lips faltering as though someone had pulled the strings from a puppet's mouth. For once, she had no quick retort, no rehearsed cruelty to follow up with. The silence was so thick you could hear the air conditioner rattle in the ceiling. I let the pause drag long enough to savor the tension, then turned my eyes back to the glass, as if nothing extraordinary had been said. My mother's laughter had always been the soundtrack to my humiliation, a sound rehearsed over decades, but that night it collapsed on itself. She stammered something about not meaning it that way, but her voice carried no conviction. The room had already shifted, the spotlight no longer flattering her but exposing her. It wasn't the first time she had used me as her target practice. Growing up, humiliation was her weapon of choice, the sharpest tool in her kit, and she wielded it without mercy. If my report card came back with straight A's, she would say, "Too bad you didn't inherit your brother's charm. Grades can't buy you love." When I landed my first job out of college, she dismissed it as cute, saying, "Maybe one day you'll get something real, like Mark." Mark, of course, could fall flat on his face, and she would call it an opportunity to grow. I learned early that my role wasn't to succeed, but to provide contrast, to be the dim bulb that made her chosen child shine brighter. That night at the party, though, the humiliation had a different edge. Perhaps it was the way she said it, a declaration carved into stone, something meant not just to sting, but to erase me. She didn't just insult me, she erased me from the family ledger in front of everyone who mattered to her. It should have broken me, but instead, it lit something cold and steady inside me. Because unlike every other time she had tried to flatten me, I was no longer standing without armor. I had spent years quietly preparing for this moment, though I hadn't known exactly when it would come. I watched her face that night, the way her painted smile cracked into confusion. It was almost funny how quickly her confidence collapsed when she realized I wasn't playing my part, wasn't standing there wide-eyed, waiting for her approval or her cruelty. And while she stood there, gripping her glass too tightly, I remembered the stack of papers I had at home, documents that weren't meant for my eyes, but had been left where someone like me, someone she thought invisible, could find them. I swirled the wine, tilted my head as though the conversation bored me, and thought to myself that leaving forever was not just an escape. It was the perfect revenge she didn't see coming. She thought she had control, but the truth was, I had been quietly gathering mine, piece by piece, over years of silence. And as the whispers rippled across the party, as the relatives avoided her eyes, I knew this was only the beginning. What they didn't know, what none of them could have guessed, was that I hadn't spoken out of bitterness. I hadn't made an empty threat. I had been planning my exit, and not just to leave behind the house where I had grown up as the family scapegoat, but to leave with something far more valuable than their approval. I wasn't running, I was already halfway gone. And while my mother's laughter had stopped cold, she hadn't yet realized what else she was about to lose. That night, she thought she had silenced me with a declaration. She hadn't realized she'd given me the perfect opening line to the last story she'd ever control. When I finally slipped out of the party with the sort of slow, unhurried composure that makes nosy people lean forward as if leaning could convert curiosity into knowledge, I drove the long way home through quiet streets that still had last season's wreath hooks on the doors and porch lights that burn like overcooked sugar, and I let the silence of the car hold space for the decision I had just made public. Because saying I would leave forever in front of them all was not a performance, but the last step in a string of steps I had been taking in plain sight of everyone who never bothered to look. I unlocked my apartment and walked straight past the dishes in the sink and the half-folded laundry on the chair and set my purse on the kitchen counter with the carefulness of someone disarming a small bomb. Because I knew what came next would change the balance that had ruled my family for years, and I wanted to feel every inch of the moment as it arrived. On the top shelf of my closet, behind the box of winter boots I never wore because my mother had declared them too practical to be flattering, I kept a flat envelope with a rubber band that had given up somewhere in the middle and clung to itself the way exhausted people cling to their habits, and inside that envelope were photocopies and screenshots and a few handwritten notes. The result of months of small notices that never seemed important when taken alone, but told a very different story when arranged side by side like tiles on a kitchen backsplash. There was the trust amendment my mother printed and left face down on the guest room desk the weekend I watered her plants. The brokerage summary she asked me to scan for her and email to an accountant whose tone in the reply suggested he had long ago stopped questioning the ethics of clients who described gifts to one child as loans and loans to the other as lessons. And there were the frantic transfers labeled with soft euphemisms. Bridge support, shortfall smoothing, temporary cover, that somehow always coincided with my brother's bursts of entrepreneurial genius and his equally predictable avalanches of consequence. I am not proud of how easily I learned the rhythms of her secrecy, how quickly I recognized the scent of panic perfume on her collar after another call with the bank, or how effortlessly I could lift the lid of the family story and see the gears turning underneath. Yet what choice do you have when you are the daughter assigned the role of cautionary tale, other than to become a historian of the casual harm done in your name? I did not steal anything. I did not hack anyone. I simply paid attention where no one thought attention could live, and I kept my mouth shut until the architecture of the truth could hold its own weight without creaking. On my desk was a second envelope with a different weight to it, the one that held my passport renewal receipt, the employment offer that used phrases like relocation support and cultural integration. The letter from a woman named Sophia who ran a small public affairs team in a city by the water where winter means real snow and not the social performance of posting pictures of scarves. And a list of tasks the consulate had sent with the kind of bureaucratic clarity that feels almost tender when you have grown up with people who prefer ambiguity because it lets them rewrite history at the breakfast table. I had been learning the language in the evenings, whispering verbs as I brushed my teeth, counting fruit at the grocery store in a foreign tongue like a child playing alone, and while my mother enjoyed retelling the story of my supposed restlessness, I was constructing a life that did not require her permission to begin. The temptation that night was to send everything at once, to fire off a family-wide message that would turn the group chat into a bonfire, yet experience had taught me that explosions attract sympathy for whoever looks most singed. And my mother had always known how to look singed without ever stepping into the flames, so I chose precision instead of noise. I opened my laptop, drafted a carefully warm note to Aunt Sharon thanking her for helping with the cake pickup and apologizing for leaving early, and at the end of that message, I tucked a single line that read as casually as a grocery list. Please confirm you received the attached receipt I found near Mom's purse so I can drop it at the accountant's, and I attached exactly one page, a cropped screenshot of a transfer labeled bridge support with my brother's initials, a date from late spring, and an amount modest enough to feel plausible while large enough to make any gossiper's heartbeat pick up. I hit send and sat back in my chair, listening to the refrigerator hum like a contented animal, knowing that the screenshot would not stay with my aunt for long. Because the thing about people who worship appearances is that they always trust the choir more than the truth, and Sharon's choir was the entire extended family plus the neighbors who hovered like birds around any hint of seed. And by morning my mother's soft euphemisms would have been carried room to room until they felt like facts. Spoken by a chorus. The revenge tonight was not the grand reveal or the dramatic confrontation she trained me to expect. It was a quiet adjustment to the room's oxygen, a shift so slight it would take her hours to notice she was breathing harder. And by the time she identified the source, she would already be defending a story that had begun to slip out of her hands. By morning the city had that washout brightness that makes everything look like a photograph of itself, and although I had not slept much beyond a handful of stubborn minutes stitched together by coffee, I felt steadier than I had the night before. Because once you nudge a secret into daylight, the world rearranges itself to accommodate the shape of the truth, and you no longer have to carry its weight alone. My phone lit up with the expected chain of messages in a rhythm only families can achieve, ping after ping dancing through interpretations dressed up as concern, gossip pretending to be prayer, and bewilderment masquerading as outrage. All of it converging on the same fragile thesis that surely there was an explanation, and surely Aunt Sharon had misread a receipt, and surely I was stirring trouble because disappointment must always be noisy, yet the attachment had already done its quiet work. And I recognized the specific silences between the lines, those pauses when even the loudest relatives do not know which performance to choose. I showered, dressed in the same unremarkable jeans I wear when I need to feel invisible, and opened the second folder on my laptop, the one dedicated to the golden voice pattern. Because however much my mother loved to imagine Mark as a self-made comet blazing across a sky of lesser men, he was in reality a weather balloon filled with other people's helium, rising just long enough to convince the neighbors he defied gravity, before sagging back to the ground with the weary grace of late afternoon. The documents were not dramatic if you looked at them one at a time. A tip from a freelance designer who had not been paid for a promotional campaign that never launched. A curt email from a supplier reminding him that extensions are a courtesy, not a business model. A blurry photo of a poker night where the minimum buy-in had teeth. And a credit card statement where optimism and delusion took turns in describing the same expense. Yet together these fragments formed a story I knew by heart. Because I had watched my mother fund the narrative every time the plot lost momentum, calling it family support while insisting I develop resilience by doing without. You do not topple a favored son by accusation, since accusation invites the ritual of denial, and denial has always been their shared liturgy, so I chose a more domestic instrument, as ordinary as a kitchen timer and twice as inevitable. I exported a polished one-page invoice summary using a neutral template I had found on a small business forum, formatted neatly enough to pass beneath any tired accountant's eyes, and sent it not to my family, but to one of Mark's brighter acquaintances. A woman named Dana who had once approached me at a barbecue to ask, in a tone that suggested both admiration and warning, whether my brother usually remembered the difference between a promise and a plan. My email introduced me as a volunteer tidying up outstanding items before a quarter close for Mark's venture, an explanation so boring it sounded true, and it attached a single page listing a past due amount from a vendor whose patience had expired, alongside a note that a wire would be released immediately upon receipt of updated banking details. What happened next unfolded with the predictable choreography of unpaid bills meeting the kind of extroverts who consider follow-up a sport. Dana forwarded the summary to a group thread that included 2 investors who had been on the fence and one who prided himself on sniffing out risk quicker than he sniffed out opportunity. And within an hour I saw the ripple hit my brother's calendar because he texted our mother with a message so long it broke into stacked rectangles, the digital shape of panic, asking her to call him right away and to please just cover this one last hiccup because he could not afford embarrassment right now. The request would have gone straight to the usual reservoir if last night had not turned the water cloudy, but now my mother hesitated, not because she had suddenly acquired ethics, rather because reputation is a currency with exchange rates. And the market had shifted overnight, so she called me first in a voice so falsely gentle it might have been a lullaby, asking whether I had spoken to anyone about private family matters and whether I understood what chaos rumor could cause when decent people were simply trying to help a young man build his future. I told her that rumor requires invention while documentation requires eyesight, and that my involvement extended only to wishing everyone a pleasant week. Then I suggested she ask Mark to read his operating agreement, the clause about capital calls, and to consider why the very people he hoped to impress were now asking where the money went, because sometimes the only education that works is the kind that arrives with receipts. She hung up with a clipped goodbye that sounded like a door catching on a rug, and within minutes I watched the second phase of my morning unfold as Mark's partner sent a formality notice demanding an accounting within a very short window and hinting, with lawyerly poetry, at remedies available when partners confuse company funds with personal consolation. The revenge for today was not theatrical, yet it was exquisitely tailored, since it forced my brother to answer questions he had always outsourced to our mother's purse and made her defend a narrative she had always controlled from the shadows. And while neither of them could see my fingerprints anywhere, both of them could feel the furniture moving, which was all I needed. By the time afternoon slid into that lazy amber hour where suburban pride shows its seams and people pretend their lawns do not require constant bargaining with the weather, the ripples had turned into small waves. And although my phone kept coughing up messages that alternated between inquiries disguised as support and accusations wrapped in concern, I set it face down on the table and focused on the piece of revenge I had promised myself I would execute while everyone was still catching their breath, because retribution that arrives before the narrative has congealed tends to set the narrative in concrete, and I intended to pour it with the steadiness of someone who has measured the mold twice. My mother's kingdom had always been a collection of small courts in which she reigned through smiles sharpened into tools, and the most important among them was the neighborhood foundation she chaired, a glossy committee that mixed philanthropy with social currency and allowed her to sprinkle generosity like glitter while keeping one hand firmly on the dimmer switch of truth. So I aimed there, not with a blow that would make her a martyr, but with a pressure that would make her explain herself to the very people she used for lighting. The foundation was hosting a donor appreciation brunch at the community center the next morning, a carefully curated event with a slideshow, a podium, and a volunteer roster that read like the guest list of a garden tour, and because I had helped with tech in years past, which is to say I plugged in the projector while ladies discussed seating charts like military campaigns, I still had the shared drive link where they stored agendas, drafts, and the spreadsheet that converted pledges into slides featuring names, dedications, and those polite phrases that make giving feel like a personality trait. So I opened the sheet with a familiar sense of detachment and added exactly one row with a pledge already recorded, but missing its dedication. A row my mother had attributed to a family friend whose check always arrived at the last second, and into the dedication cell I typed a sentence so bland it passed the sniff test yet so pointed it would stick to her like the aftertaste of cheap champagne, in gratitude for daughters who invest quietly and are finally seen. I formatted it precisely like the others, saved the file, closed the tab, and allowed myself to breathe in the cool satisfaction of a needle that slides in under the skin without drawing blood. It would have been tempting to add more, to lace the slides with sharp hints and theatrical reveals, but restraint is the difference between a stunt and an outcome. And I wanted an outcome where the room would tilt toward doubt without a single person being able to accuse me of shouting, so I turned instead to the second lever, the one labeled accountability that committees pretend is boring until it becomes contagious. And I emailed the treasurer, who also happened to be my mother's favorite, Echo, with a perfectly ordinary question about whether the year-end summary would itemize donor-directed disbursements by project, citing a hypothetical curiosity about transparency that any auditor would applaud. Then I CC'd the general inbox so that a few more eyes, the quiet ones who always do the real work, would see the note before my mother could vacuum it up. Predictably, the treasurer replied with a flustered version of yes, no, maybe, and my mother, who must have been sitting inside the inbox like a cat in a laundry basket, called within minutes using a voice that tried to braid condescension into calm. asking me not to confuse the process with unnecessary detail and reminding me that public acts of giving do not need private autopsies, at which point I told her that good causes love sunlight and that the dedication line she overlooked had already been saved by the team, so any adjustments would have to be made through the proper channel, which of course meant asking the volunteers who actually controlled the slide deck. And she went quiet in that way she goes quiet when the stagehand refuses to move the light. The next morning's brunch unfurled with the usual choreography: cold brew in glass carafes, centerpieces of seasonal greens, greeting chicas giggle, and the soothing promise that everyone present was both virtuous and photogenic. Yet, when the slideshow reached the row I had prepared and the dedication bloomed on the screen in a font so neutral it might have been the voice of the building itself, I watched from the back as faces tilted, as the treasurer's mouth pinched into a lemon of worry, as my mother blinked a fraction too long before smiling exactly as wide as the room required, and as Aunt Sharon's head turned not toward me, but toward the cluster of neighbors who served as her rumor relay. And in that soft intake of collective breath, I felt the smallest shift of gravity, as if the chandelier had noticed its own weight. She could not object without appearing petty. She could not erase the line without confronting the transparent process she bragged about during every funding appeal, and she could not ignore it because the dedication made a category visible that she had worked for years to keep abstract. So she did the only thing left to her and thanked the donor with a warmth that vibrated like a held note, which meant the sentence would survive the morning and the photos and the newsletter, and the idea it carried would begin to root in the minds of people who measured character the way they measured shrub height, with an eye for proportion. I left before she could corner me with that smile she wears when she is deciding which flavor of punishment will feel like love. And I walked down the sidewalk past parked cars that reflected the sky in tired ovals while I typed a short message to Dana containing a tidy update about the investor's request for an accounting and a friendly reminder that vendors appreciate timely closure. Because one thread is decorative, but two threads pull fabric, and as I slid the phone into my bag I felt the tremor of a new text arriving from an unknown number with the kind of punctuation that signals a lawyer trying to be human, inviting me to discuss, at my convenience, certain questions regarding a trust amendment executed in a year my mother always edited in conversation, and though I did not answer on the spot, I knew the conversation would not wait long, because when a bolt slides in a lock that has stuck for years, you do not pause to admire the door you push. The lawyer who texted me turned out to speak in sentences that behaved like carefully placed stepping stones rather than threats, and while I sat across from him in a small office that smelled of paper and coffee warmed twice, he opened a folder with the patience of someone unwrapping a difficult gift, explaining that a trust is not a fairy tale told at brunch, but a structure that either stands or collapses under the weight of its own clauses, and that when a trustee conducts transfers under euphemisms while presenting them to some as gifts and to others as discipline, one can, with polite firmness and the right requests for accounting, invite the structure to describe itself in plain language. I did not ask for revenge to arrive wearing a judge's robe, because I had no hunger for courtrooms or headlines. I asked only for the kind of formal letter that causes people who prefer performance over procedure to realize the script is no longer theirs. And he drafted it as if he were writing music, balanced and unhurried, requesting ledgers, statements, and a schedule of loans and repayments for a period long enough to make patterns unavoidable. Then he slid it across the desk for my signature and told me, without drama, that silence would no longer be an option for anyone who had grown accustomed to speaking only when the audience was friendly. I walked out into late light that made ordinary sidewalks look lacquered and thought about how strangely calm this felt, not because the stakes were small, but because something inside me had finally stepped off the stage where I had been forced to react to other people's applause and ridicule, and onto a smaller, quieter path I had chosen myself. At home I opened the envelope of documents one last time, stacked the copies into a tidy packet labeled with a date and a single word, departure, and placed beside it the other packet I had been preparing for the foundation. A compilation of friendly questions that, taken together, suggested the kind of transparency drive donors adore and chairwomen dread when their authority depends on curated mystery. Then I set a timer in my head for the hours remaining before my flight and began the choreographed leaving I had rehearsed for months in the privacy of my kitchen. I wrote my mother a message that was neither conciliatory nor cruel, a message that recorded the facts so that later no one could pretend amnesia, telling her that a formal request for an accounting had been sent, that I would not be discussing it by phone because the story of money tends to change shape when it passes through the mouth, that my employment abroad began in 1 week and I would be unavailable during my initial orientation, and that I wished for her the grace she had always withheld from me, since even people who build their lives on control sometimes deserve the relief of handing their story to paper and letting it speak. I did not mention the slides, the dedication, the quiet invoice, or the gossip currents now running like small rivers through our social circle, and I did not ask her to apologize, because apologies from her had always arrived dressed as warnings, which is a costume that fits poorly in the light. At the airport, the display boards shuffled cities like cards, and the overhead announcements repeated themselves with the comforting predictability of ritual, while I sat with a paper cup and the envelope of my future in my bag, and the phone on the table buzzing with messages that reached like hands through a closing door. My brother had sent a single sentence that tried to sound noble and landed somewhere between truce and surrender, assuring me that things were being handled and that our family should not be dragged through mud, which was his way of saying that consequences felt unfair when they refused to stay in other people's pockets, and Aunt Sharon had sent a string of questions punctuated by her theater of concern, wanting to make sure I was safe, to confirm that rumors were only rumors, to collect the final piece that would allow her to declare herself the guardian of truth at lunch tomorrow. I replied to none of them, not because I lacked generosity, but because I finally understood that silence can be a door that protects as well as excludes. When boarding began, I stood with that soft ache that accompanies endings and beginnings, and I felt the weight of a final decision I had made the night before while looking at my apartment as though it were a hotel room borrowed from a kinder version of my life. A decision to send one last message the moment the plane pushed back from the gate, a message to the extended family group attaching a compressed folder containing selected screenshots, invoices, and politely highlighted lines, accompanied by a single sentence asking whether anyone had advice on the best way to catalog loans labeled as gifts, because nothing spreads faster in a community built on appearances than a question delivered without theatrics, and nothing endures longer than a document that refuses to blink. The nose of the plane turned toward the runway. The engines deepened into that reassuring growl that feels like commitment, and I pressed send without watching the screen for replies, because revenge, when it has done its work properly, does not require applause or even acknowledgement. It asks only that the people who shaped your childhood into a classroom for humiliation be forced to learn the language of accountability, preferably from one another. Somewhere over the water, where night folds itself into the window and makes the cabin feel suspended between stories, I closed my eyes and tried to imagine what would be said in the rooms I had left, whether my mother would attempt to split herself into two versions: the charitable leader who suffered a daughter's ungratefulness, and the private manager who had only ever acted out of love, and whether my brother would finally learn how to answer a question without borrowing someone else's voice, and I let the uncertainty stay with me like a companion rather than an enemy, because ambiguity, when it isn't a weapon, can be the space where you build a life without permission. I do not know whether the trust will be rebalanced, whether the foundation will welcome a quiet audit in the name of donor confidence, whether the house where I learned to shrink will be listed for sale to pay off the debts of a golden child, or whether the next family gathering will feature a revised script with me cut from the cast entirely, and perhaps I will never know, because there is a difference between banishing and choosing the privacy of distance. The plane tilted gently toward a continent I had not yet earned, the seatbelt light chimed, and I rested my palm against the closed envelope in my bag, feeling its quiet geometry, while somewhere below a phone on a kitchen counter began to light up with messages that would force old habits into daylight, and I allowed myself the smallest smile at the thought that the story might continue without me, that the last line would not be mine to deliver, and that leaving forever might be less a threat than a promise I finally kept.